Okay, so I've kicked off the recording, and so just to kind of introduce the topics we want to cover today. So, hi everyone, this is our community meeting for October 2020 for Kyverno, and what we wanted to go through today is just some quick updates, demos on features we're working on currently, and then we'll also talk about some of the things we have on our roadmap. And we can quickly discuss if there's any other open issues or items from anyone. We can talk through those as well. So the few things on our, for updates and demos we wanted to cover, the major item we're working on is migrating away from policy violations, moving to a policy report. So the idea is there'll be reports for different scopes. And then these reports are flexible enough where even other policy engines, like for CIS benchmarks, et cetera, can generate the same reports, which can be used through management tools. And then the other, demo we will show is for config map based lookups. This was a new feature that was introduced, which we did not cover in our last meeting. So we'll cover those two quickly. And with the reporting, we'll also show, by the way, on the CLI, as well as, talk a little bit about the structure of the report, et cetera, what happens, inside in the engine itself. So with that, let me hand off to Pooja and Shooting. We'll cover the first two pieces, and then I'll talk about a little bit about one of the major items on our roadmap, which is the API data lookup and the JavaScript support that we want to add in the future. So Pooja, were you gonna first show, or Shooting, are you gonna talk a little bit more about the report, or how should we proceed?
I think we can start with Pooja.
Okay.
Okay. Hi everyone, this is Pooja. So today I'm going to show you the various type of inputs that we are going to take in Kyverno CLI to generate the policy reports. So yeah. So the general format in the CLI will be same as how we apply now. So Kyverno apply the policy and minus our resource. The format is going to be the same. And let's now check for some scenarios. So in case if we are going to pass the policy and resource both as file or as folder, so here the format is going to be Kyverno apply your policy file or folder path and minus our resource file path or folder path. So this is also what we currently support. And now coming to the next scenario, we have policy and resources which are present in your cluster and that you want to apply. So in this case, Kyverno apply minus minus cluster. What this will do is it will extract all the policy and all the resources and apply. You can also use namespace here for filtering. So if you whenever you're using any namespace here, the policy and the resources which are applied are from that specific namespace.
So in this case, all the policies and resources are get from the cluster, from the given cluster, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so next let's see more combinations. So here I'm taking the policy as a file or as a folder, and you want to apply on the cluster resources. So you can give it as Kyverno apply your policy file or folder path and minus minus cluster. So if you are not writing minus r any resource name, so it implies you will be applying the policy on the whole cluster resources. The same you can filter it with namespace. So you can provide a namespace here and the resources will be filtered from the specific namespace. Going for the next scenario, if you want to apply the policy on a specific resource which is present in the cluster. You can simply mention -r and it's the resource name which is present in the cluster. So this here also the same way you can filter the resource uh, if you want to filter the resource on based on the namespaces. Then moving forward, if you want to apply the policy which are available in the cluster and you have the resources as saved in some file or folders, then you can apply it as Kyverno apply -r and your resource file or folder name. So here we are not specifying any policy. So it will take all the policy which are present in your cluster. The same you can filter the policy according to the namespaces if you will apply -n namespace flag. The next one, when you have a specific policy in your, when you want to specify a specific policy from your cluster. So you can simply give the name of the policy and apply on the resource. If you want to filter it according to your namespace, you can use -n flag. Here the same combination. I'm just taking the policy and resource from the cluster, but you know like which policy from the cluster you want to apply on which resource. So both are the policy and resource both are taken from the cluster and you're specifying the name here for the policy name and for the resource name. Similarly, you can even filter this uh, on based on the namespace flag. Next, if you want, so we have policy which are namespace policy and also our global policies. So in case of conflicts, or if you want to apply a specific policy from a namespace, you can specify the namespace like this before the policy and the policy name, and uh, then you can just apply on the resource. So here you can apply the different combination of resources and you can also filter it based on your namespace. So here the namespace what you're going to apply here will be same as this namespace, should be same as this namespace. The next when So next, when you have the resource with the same name, you can also pass it with kind. So here we can see you can apply here the policy as any file or from a cluster, and the resources you can mention it with its namespace, its kind, and the resource name. Here also you can filter it directly with namespace. If you are not mentioning here any namespace, the namespace will be taken default from the flag. So these are some cases which we are going to support. So that's it from my side. So I hand it over to Shuri.
Yeah, just add a few points to this policy reports AI. Generally, we will support two types of CLI. One is to apply the local resource and one is to apply local policy to local resource and generate the policy report accordingly. And another option is to apply the policy, whether it's inside the cluster or outside the cluster, to the resources. And again, it can be outside of cluster and then inside of the cluster, and then generate the report accordingly. So those, what Pooja has shown, those combinations, basically that's what we want to achieve, is to generate the policy on different type of resources.
Yeah, so this way in their CI/CD pipeline, if a policy is being tested, you can apply it to a cluster, see what the report or what would be the results even before saving the policy. And same thing, I guess, if you're changing a resource, you can also apply, policies offline to the resource and see what the results could be.
Right, exactly.
Cool.
Okay, and let me share my screen. Let's move. Let's move to the next demo. So what I have here is a demo for the config map lookup. So in our latest release 1.2.0, we introduced this that you can look up the data from the config map and use whatever the data defined in the config map in your policies. Right. So a simple policy I have today is here I have a config map called rows dictionary, where I have a bunch of allowed rows specified in the data block. And then in the policy, I'm going to use this config map. So what I do here is to load the config map context and then refer the allowed rows using the JMeS path. Here, the policy is to say, whenever I see there's an annotation on the incoming resource, which does not match the allowed rows, I'm gonna deny the creation request. So simple here, I'm matching to a deployment. Whenever the rows, the annotation in the deployment does not match the allowed rows, I'm not gonna allow the creation of that deployment. Otherwise, everything should work as what it is before. Okay, so this is my policy. Let me switch to my terminal. Again, I have a Minikube 119 cluster here. And let's check if Kyverno is running. Get pod. And I'm on our latest release 1.2.0. Okay, so I think I've already have the config map created. I already installed the config map in my cluster. What am I gonna do next? Next is to create the policy to the cluster. And if we do kubectl get cpol, I can see the policies here. And then what I'm gonna show you is trying to create this resource. I have a deployment. So here, I annotate the deployment with a disallowed row, tenant operator. So what I expected is that this deployment creation should be blocked by Kyverno. And then later we'll switch to the allowed row and see what's the behavior. Okay, so first, let's create the deployment resources. Okay, cool. So here you can see we have blocked the resource creation, which with the message like this policy restrict rows, and this is a rule name. And it says the row tenant operator is not allowed in the list. Cluster min, class operator, and tenant admin. Okay, so this is how you block the resource creation when you refer the data in the config map. And then let's change the annotation to the allowed rows. Right, so here as cluster operator is allowed in the config map, so let's change it. And then try to create that resource again. Okay, so now this time you can see the deployment got successfully created. So there is no restrictions on the rows, and then this is how this config map lookup works. And in more cases, like we can support more flexible cases when you just need to put your data in the config map, and then you can refer whatever the data defined in the config map and then use that in your policy to look up any of the value you want.
Okay, so in general, if there's any external controller that can produce a config map, like even if you want to look at the CPU, memory, things like that, as long as you store them in a config map, now you can use that in some policy for comparison and things to that nature.
Right, right. That provides more flexibility. Our Kyverno care is about the data inside the config map, and how you write the data to config map. It is like you can have multiple ways to do that. But I think we also want to support that, provide that flexibility with Kyverno itself. So I guess that's the purpose of the next topic.
Yep, yeah, that's a good segue into that. So let me share and we can pull that up. Yeah, so this, on our roadmap, one of the feature items we've had and some of the issues and kind of samples we have been looking at, and also lots of folks from the community have kind of asked for requests where sometimes in a policy, you need to look up things from the cluster or from some other object, right? So there's a few different issues that, were linked over here. Like in this case, there's more complex operations to be done on an image registry. For this, it's like a selector based on existing namespace labels. In this case, it's like if you have another object like a service, you might want to check the service type and things like that, right? So in Kyverno today, one way of possibly doing that is, yeah, like what Shooting just showed is you can write a separate controller which checks for those conditions, updates a config map, and then in your policy, you can reference that data, for comparisons and things like that, right? But it's still a little bit, there's two steps. It's not as compact as packaging everything in a single policy and avoiding to write a separate controller. And the whole point of Kyverno is we want to eliminate all these custom validating, webhooks and, controllers and simplify things, right? So the way we're thinking and one approach we're prototyping and thinking is, and there's two parts to the solution. The first part is just expanding on the context, like Shooting showed. Right now, you can load things from a config map. But one possibility is we can also allow, just using API paths, allow loading any data from the API server directly into the context of a rule. And so this, request namespace is, of course, from the current request. And here we're looking up all of the ingresses. So it's looking within that namespace, it's looking for every ingress object, right? Or you could just say, instead of namespace, you could just say v1 ingress, or I believe v1 is the right API group, or whatever the right group is. If you look up all ingresses, it will store a list of ingresses um, within that in the variable that you declare here, right, which is ingresses. So then once you have that data inside of your context, the next step is, how do I easily process that data and use that data within a policy, right? So something we have prototyped is using a JavaScript virtual machine, so a JavaScript VM, which would be executed inside of Kyverno. So within that rule itself, we would be able to declare a JavaScript function, which takes the context. It takes a single variable, and then returns allow or deny, so true or false as the result. So in this case, what we're doing is, since we get the context has ingresses, we can loop through each of the, and here we're using underscore to loop through all of the ingresses, and then checking if that name is already used by one of the ingresses. And if it is, we return false, which is deny, right? Otherwise, if it's not used, we can return true, and that new ingress is allowed to be created. So this combination, first, looking up API server data. And by the way, this could be any endpoint, right? It could be metrics, things like that too. So it doesn't have to be limited to objects or list of objects, but you can also look up like things like, other things from a pod as you need to. And then So even like, for example, status information would be available. If you want to look at things like quotas and look up certain status and store that into a variable, that could be done. And then you can write your own custom JavaScript to process that, and make sure that you just return true or false. So today we want to kind of limit this to just validate rules, but certainly in the future it's possible to think about even expanding this to mutate and other, so allowing some custom logic. So, and the nice thing about JavaScript is it's fairly easy to process JSON data, which the API is structured as JSON, the results are structured as JSON data. So, it's fairly straightforward to and simple to write some, simple control logic like this to be able to take some actions based on what we're fetching from the API server. So that's, one of the features we're looking at once we wrap up all of the policy report. Once we do that migration, that will be in the next major release. And so any thoughts, feedback, or opinions on this would be welcome. You can post directly into the GitHub issue or just reach out on Slack to discuss. And, I think this will expand certainly the use cases and things that can be done with Kyverno. And again, eliminate the need for supporting, additional custom controllers to kind of achieve some policy logic. Any questions or thoughts on that?
No, I just want to say this feature provides us more flexibility on the like different kinds of use cases that we can address. I think this is super powerful.
Right, and yes, I think what we will have to make sure, there's few concerns, of course, is like the performance, how long these lookups can take, and then also potentially, security concerns, right? So can this be used to somehow, execute something, malicious, right? So what we will have to make sure is we are checking the JavaScript has to be bounded. It can only be a function. It can only take a single argument. It should only return true or false. So all of those things we'll have to pre-validate and
Right.
not allow some arbitrary code to be executed. And we're not loading, you can't like load external libraries or anything like that, right? So it's a fairly restricted execution environment, but allows us to process API server data in an easy manner, right? So I think it just seems like a nice step above the config map approach, where config maps are nice, but somebody has to manage them externally. This, lets you just cut out that step and directly query the API server for the data we need. The other thing we can potentially do is, based on the paths we see in a policy, it could be possible to try and optimize those and cache certain data, right? So if we are seeing that ingresses, like for example, in this exam, ingresses are looked up, maybe we can write an informer which caches that, right? So then we don't have to, the query and the lookup will be faster if we have some well-known paths. Now, in certain cases, we may not able to optimize, but we can try and create those sort of optimizations over time if we feel that that's necessary for scale. Yeah, so it'll be a pretty exciting step, and I think it seems like that way we can solve some more complex cases with these policy decisions and utilize them, and then once we do that for validate, we'll see if we can somehow use this also for mutate and generate if there's some interesting use cases to address where more complex logic is required. All right. Yeah. The other thing I want to kind of just quickly mention, and there's, as probably everybody saw, we did launch a new website. So, there's lots of, we moved all the documentation and things to there. Thanks to you, Raj, for getting that kicked off and all of his help on that. But it's fairly complete now. And over time, we'll also, look at the sample policies, how we can get a lot of other information in there as well. But certainly we'll continue improving and refining. Let us know if you see any problems or if anything else needs to be covered in the documentation, etc. So I think that's everything we had for this week. Any other items or things to bring up?
Not from my side.
Nothing from my side.
Okay. All right. So thanks everyone, and we'll see you next time. In the meantime, feel free to reach out, on Slack or through GitHub or the mailing group. See you later. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.